Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We're very pleased to welcome Paul Clarke-Scholes today, who's kindly agreed to deliver this session. We also have with us Adam Ellsworth, who is a member of the Broadcasting and Telecommunications group here at IOSH. So I'm going to shortly hand you over to Adam with a short introduction for the session, but before I do, I just wanted to mention a few things from our side here. So firstly, for those of you who haven't attended one of our IOSH webinars, I'm Ben Pollard, and I will be taking care of the technical aspects today. So if there are any problems at your end, I will try to assist as best as I can. So on your screen then, at the top left-hand side, you'll notice a small bar with some written options on them. You've got chat and Q&A. If you have any technical issues or audio problems and you need to message me at any point, please use the chat option. If you have any specific questions for Paul relating to the content of the session, then you can ask those using the Q&A option. At the end of Paul's presentation, Adam will then facilitate a Q&A and they'll run through all of the questions that you have asked. If for any reason we do run out of time and there are still unanswered questions remaining at the end, we'll review these later with the intention of posting these as written responses following the webinar. Finally, just so that you are aware, the session is being recorded for future playback. So with all that said, I'm now going to hand you over to Adam and he's going to kickstart the session. So Adam, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this IOSH Broadcasting and Telecoms Group webinar on asbestos. My name's Adam Ellsworth, and I volunteer as a committee member for the group. So this session today forms part of our Work 2022 plan, supporting the group's members and helping us all shape the future of health and safety. If you've not seen the plan or checked out the group, then please do take a look. You can find all the detail on our group site, which is accessible from the main IOSH site. So today, I'm delighted to have with us Paul Clarke-Scholes of Clifford, Devlin. Paul's over 33 years experience in the asbestos sector and has project managed complex decontamination projects for numerous key developments in London. In that time, he's gained a comprehensive knowledge of the issues and legislation relevant to remediating asbestos from commercial, residential and public sector properties, both as a consultant and working for licensed contractors. And of course, Paul is a chartered member of IOSH. Paul, over to you.
Hello everybody. Right, I'm going to start with a brief overview of why asbestos remains to be such a problem and some of its properties and the risks associated with it. Asbestos, of course, is a term used to describe 6 naturally occurring fibrous minerals whose properties include the ability to withstand fire, heat, chemical attack and electrical currents. The most common types of asbestos, particularly as far as we're concerned in the UK, are chrysotile, which is white asbestos, crucidolite, which is blue, and then amosite, which is brown, technically known as grunerite. Amosite is actually a brand name standing for Asbestos Mines of South Africa, but we've been calling it amosite for so long that we don't seem to be able to stop ourselves. Asbestos, of course, has one major drawback. As a mineral, it has a particular crystalline structure. That crystalline structure allows the fibers to continually subdivide, reaching ever smaller particle size, which enables them to penetrate very deeply into the lungs, causing scarring and damage to the lung tissue, and eventually leading to various fatal diseases. According to the latest HSE stats, asbestos-related diseases currently account for approximately 5,000 deaths per annum still. Currently about 2,250 deaths from mesothelioma, a similar number believed to originate from lung cancer, and then a further 500 or so which are associated with asbestosis. Looking at each of these diseases then, and in increasing order of severity, first we have non-malignant pleural diseases. This is a non-cancerous condition affecting the outer lining of the lung, which is the pleura, and there are actually 2 forms of the disease: diffuse pleural thickening and the less serious pleural plaques. There were actually 450 new cases of pleural thickening assessed for industrial injuries disablement benefit in 2017. Asbestosis, by contrast, is a form of pneumoconiosis caused by the inhalation of asbestos fibres, characterised by scarring and inflammation of the lungs. It's a chronic and irreversible condition in which symptoms typically start to develop several decades after the first exposure. Those symptoms will often progress to seriously affect a person's normal daily activities and can also lead to various complications which can in fact be fatal. It is generally recognised that heavy asbestos exposures are required in order to produce clinically significant asbestosis, which suggests that the cases occurring today are originating from very high exposures back in the 1970s and before. Asbestos-related cancers, lung cancer particularly, are quite difficult to pin down precise numbers because of the number of different causes of lung cancer and the difficulties in correctly identifying the individual causative agent. But again, HSE estimate that we have approximately the same number of lung cancer cases as we do mesothelioma cases, so about 2,500 per year. Mesothelioma, probably a term most of you are familiar with, is a specific form of cancer almost uniquely associated with exposure to asbestos. And this affects the pleura, again, the external lining of the lung, and also the peritoneum, the lining of the lower digestive tract. Again, it takes many years to develop following the inhalation of asbestos fibres. And cases are often diagnosed at an advanced stage because the symptoms are typically non-specific and only actually appear late in the development of the disease. The disease itself is almost always fatal and often as quickly as within 12 to 18 months of the onset of symptoms. Last figures we've looked at show that the survival rate to 5 years is as low as 8%. And mesothelioma has such a strong relationship with asbestos, the annual cases give a particularly clear view of the effect of past exposure. Because the disease is usually fatal following onset, the number of annual deaths closely approximates the annual new number of cases. It's a very accurate way for HSE to track disease figures in the UK. So those figures look like this. The annual deaths in Britain have increased steeply over the last 50 years as a consequence of the mainly occupational asbestos exposures that occurred because of the widespread industrial use of asbestos between the 1950s and the 1980s. There were 2,595 mesothelioma deaths in Great Britain in 2016, broadly similar to the previous 4 years. The latest projections suggest that these will continue to rise for the next few years before beginning to decline. Approximately 80% of mesothelioma cases occur in men. This reflects the greater likelihood of men having worked with asbestos in construction and other heavy industries. But you will notice that there is a consistent number of female cases. Those are quite worrying because they're quite often associated with much lower exposures and as a consequence of them having been married to a spouse who worked in one of these heavy industries. Mesothelioma is also mostly diagnosed in people aged over 70. Approximately 80% of the total of 5,500 people suffering from asbestos-related diseases are aged over 70. And again, with a long latency period, that still means we're looking at deaths today that are principally down to exposure going back as far as 1970. Part of the reason for that is that the diseases have such a long latency period. You can see from the slide here, in actual fact, the average latency period is 47.9 years in men, which means the disease can occur anywhere between 20 and 60 years after the initial exposure. Slightly higher in women, interestingly, at 53.3 years. Now, the HSE estimate that 1.3 million tradespeople are at risk of asbestos exposure and that they could come into contact with asbestos as many as 100 times a year. Contractors such as carpenters, electricians and plumbers continue to be the most at risk of developing occupational diseases. And it has been recently estimated that as many as 20 tradesmen lose their lives every week to an asbestos-related disease. The concept of a third wave of asbestos victims is currently being cited, which includes telephone engineers and cable layers who may drill, disturb, or just come into contact with asbestos materials located in the properties in which they work. There is further concern that recently installers of the new fibre optic cables may even be the next group of workers to be classified as potential exposure victims. So where can you find it? The Telecoms slant for today. My mistake. Just to illustrate the point as we're talking about diseases, we'll take a short break for a video regarding a recent sufferer. He will tell you his story, but the interesting thing about this chap is that he's aged only 50 years of age and is suffering from mesothelioma.
Well, virtually every job that we did was boiler, mainly refurbishment for industrial premises, hospitals, or large factories where they'd have boiler houses that had 2, 3, 4 boilers in them, huge things. So there'd be all the instrumentation, because they'd all have control panels. So that would be the side we were on, and the gauges, etc. But of course, all the pipework was being refitted as well. So all the old pipework was being pulled out, and as I now have been told, that it was these older ones were insulated with asbestos. So as the guys were ripping out the old pipework and the old insulation, that was how the asbestos got in the atmosphere. Nobody was wearing a mask on anybody, on all my colleagues from the same company. None of us were. At the end of March, I came out with lots of egg-sized lumps all over my arms and legs. They didn't hurt unless you touched them. And at the time, it was thought it might be sarcoidosis, which is a rare disease, or tuberculosis, which was very quickly ruled out. So I was referred to the chest clinic at the local hospital, and basically it was going there every 6 weeks, having an X-ray, basically seeing nothing was changing, coming away, and that's how it was from March. They kept telling me you might feel breathless, and there's a whole host of different things. I had a cough all the time, but I never felt breathless, and I was fine. I was playing squash and doing everything that I normally would. And then just at the end of September, the very last weekend, just woke up on the Saturday, got out of bed, and I was out of breath, just getting out of bed. So I thought, oh, right. Because I had my next appointment on the Monday, I didn't do anything about it that day. I waited till the Monday. And when I went in and had the X-ray, as soon as they saw it, they said, we're going to admit you to hospital. So I was admitted on the Tuesday. But I was then in hospital pretty much 6 or 7 weeks at that time. And they did all kinds of tests. And drained my lung. They took 5 pints of liquid off my left lung. Took samples as well while they were doing that. Everything came back negative. Couldn't find anything. They did a bronchoscopy. Couldn't find anything. Everything looked normal. They did a CT scan. Nothing showed up. Loads and loads of X-rays. Nothing ever untoward. Finally, they sent me to another hospital for a biopsy on my lymph nodes, which were enlarged, which I'd known again from March. I'd known that. But it was assumed they do get enlarged whenever you've got an infection in your body, so it didn't necessarily mean anything. And when they took a section of that, they found that it was malignant. And they found it was, I can't say it. I didn't want to know, for example, how long have I got? I knew it was serious. I didn't want to know things like that, because me being me, I'd put it on the calendar and I'd be thinking, right, how many days have I got left? So I didn't want to be living like that, so I didn't want to know. Basically, there was the chemo option, which they prepared me for, and it gave me, changed my medication and different things. But there was also a potential opportunity to have an operation, but it couldn't guarantee it because most people don't qualify for the operation for one reason or another. And that was being carried out in Leicester by Mr. Waller. He's the only person in this country that does that operation. So very quickly I got an appointment to see him. when people described what the operation involved, I didn't fancy it at all. So I was thinking, I'll just have the chemotherapy, you know, that doesn't sound too bad, and I'll just plod along, you know, and that sounds like, you know, I can handle that. But all my family were like, you must have the operation. Having said that, I think they had a little bit more knowledge as to what the chances were if I went down that route and didn't have the operation. So the discussion really was me saying that I'd rather go down the chemo, and, you know, my wife trying to encourage me that the operation would be the best, but that's as far as it went. My initial thoughts were that with having a young family, you know, I was very concerned about them. I was concerned about not seeing them, you know, particularly my younger one who's only 2. You know, I thought that would be terrible for me to die in the next couple of years, you know, and the impact on him and my daughter, you know, as to how that would be. Obviously my wife as well, but with, you know, my kids I was very concerned about because, you know, they wouldn't understand. So that's where we were with that. When I went down to Leicester and I saw the consultant that did the surgery, he's a very straight-talking person, you know, and he didn't necessarily say, you've only got so many months to live, but he used words like, you're in the last chance saloon and things like that. And it was enough to make me think, I haven't got a choice here. I've got to have that operation, seeing as he's offering it. You know, and he offers it to so few people. And then was back again for the operation to actually remove the whole of the left side. So that was the lung, the diaphragm, a bit of my stomach, and even you have something that holds your heart in place. He even took that out. And the diaphragm and that piece that holds your heart, that's been replaced by synthetic material. So I had all of that done on the 13th of December. Now, it's not supposed to be curative because everybody that's ever had the disease, as far as I'm aware, has always died. I'm married, I've got 2 children, a boy of 2 and a girl of 7. I've got a young family, I can't work. My wife's had to give up what she was doing as well. So we have no income. So, you know, obviously I'd rather be young and be able to beat it. But the financial implications are, you know, the money that you get, although it sounds like a lot, is nothing compared to what I would have earned. You know, it's maybe 3 years' income. Probably the worst working period of my life was that time as an electrician. I hated it, which is why I didn't complete the full apprenticeship. And so to have then find out that that was the period that's caused this, it's like, you know, it's come back to haunt me again in a way. But anger, I don't know. I mean, to find out that, you know, everybody should have been wearing masks and protective clothing and we weren't, budgets were probably tight. That kind of protection wasn't offered or discussed. And not being aware of the dangers, you know, that I was working under. I did work under those conditions. And I, you know, since I've had this disease, I find that more and more people that have it are electricians. And yeah, apparently, you know, if you're just drilling in a wall, the dust that can come out from drilling in a hole in a wall, you know, you can catch it from that. You know, there is still a lot of asbestos around and about. That's maybe not even, you know, the obvious asbestos probably has been removed, but there are still, you know, lots of areas where it is, and it's people that are crawling in roof spaces or drilling holes or going under floors, which is mainly your electricians. You know, they're going to pick it up. And they don't tend to be old people. They tend to be, you know, younger people, because it's a manual job and you've got to be fit and you've got to be able to climb under and climb over things. So it's definitely out there, otherwise I wouldn't be sat here now.
So, as I say, the important thing about Andrew is that he's actually quite young. He was born in 1969 and therefore probably exposed as an apprentice in the mid-1980s. So fairly well into the remediation and prevention of use of asbestos era, and yet his exposure has still been enough to cause mesothelioma, and also likely to be fairly representative of the types of members you guys might be representing. So let's look at where we might find asbestos applications. As we've said, extensively used in building products right up until it was banned in 1999. Peak period, particularly particularly post-war, 1950 through to the mid-1980s. And of course, not just any building that was built during that period, but any building that was refurbished during that period. At some point, the builders would have used particularly asbestos insulation board, used 60s and 70s exactly as we use plasterboard today. Anything that needs fire stopping would have got an AIB panel in it. So pretty much anything that was constructed before 1985 can contain some quite serious quantities of some quite serious asbestos containing materials. So we've been removing it since around about 1985, and we've removed a lot, but it is estimated that as many as 2.4 million homes, as much as 75% of all commercial, industrial and municipal properties, and quite worryingly, and you may have seen some of the press over the recent weekend regarding asbestos management in schools, something like 86% of all schools still contain some asbestos containing materials. And most of it is now hidden in the fabric of the buildings. So where might you find it? Floor and ceiling voids, sprayed coatings, you can see here on steelwork. Any of the sorts of voids where you might be asked to install new cabling and ducting and things like that, liable to contain a number of different asbestos containing materials. Think fire protection, particularly post-Grenfell, we're very much aware fire breaks in ceiling voids would very often have been AIB back in the day and may still be. Risers and various different voids for pipework, coverings, again, typically made out of either asbestos insulation board or lined with asbestos insulation board. In this case here, a lift shaft, again, lined out for fire protection. Walls and partitions can be constructed of AIB, or on occasions you can find that the AIB layer is actually hidden behind an outer coating. Not unusual in the day for plasterboard to be overboarded on an asbestos partition, and that AIB within the partition can still be hidden and buried. Similarly, walls and ceilings can be treated with asbestos containing textured coatings and decorative plasters. The floors as well, so walls, ceilings and floors, thermoplastic floor tiles, and of course the bitumen underneath the floor tiles that was used to hold them down will often contain more asbestos than the actual floor tiles themselves. Then roof spaces. Roof spaces can contain loose fill asbestos insulation, rare to find it these days, but sometimes you do. Asbestos pipework insulation, preformed pipework seen in that image there. Again, sprayed coatings potentially. Here particularly you can see an example of a blue asbestos sprayed coating on a structural steelwork beam. Don't see many of these anymore, but they aren't all gone. And then all sorts of other materials too. Window sills themselves, the putties and mastics around windows, or even packers between the windows. In the image there you can see a couple of metal shims below the timber member, and then somebody has found an old piece of AIB sheet or a spare piece of AIB sheet just to pack out the actual window installation. If you were looking to drill a hole to fit a cable around this window, it would be quite easy to pick the point where the asbestos packer has been used. Externally, corrugated cement sheeting. We used an awful lot of corrugated cement sheeting in this country, and downpipes and other cement products. External soffits and fascia boards. You can see a close-up here of an asbestos insulation board external soffit. Very difficult to tell beforehand whether it's going to be a cement material, an asbestos insulation board, or a timber panel without doing the appropriate level of sampling and surveying, of course. ACMs can also be found working in underground voids. There can be a risk of disturbing asbestos cement that was often used as sleeving in telecom ducts. AIB can be used as sacrificial shuttering in the formation of concrete structures. or even where an individual site has been subject to demolition in the past. Often, of course, the debris from an old demolition project wouldn't have been cleared with anything like the standards you would expect today, and a certain amount of asbestos contamination in soils, which can be disturbed by laying floor ducts, ground ducts, and the like. And then finally, the actual telecoms equipment itself. Again, back in the day, I would hazard you don't see too many of these anymore, but wasn't unusual for low voltage pipe work, low voltage cabling to be insulated with crucidolite asbestos, such as telephone cabling. And then you could also, of course, get cable sheaths used to run the cables into the floor ducts. As recently as 2018, a fibre cable installer, aged just 39, was diagnosed with mesothelioma, which was claimed to be the result of exposure whilst replacing copper cables in 2003 and 2004. Very worryingly late. It's been alleged, of course, that neither the team nor the victim were ever told that the cable carrying pipes could be made from asbestos. And interestingly, during the investigations, the cable company concerned revealed that they had still been installing those pipes right up until the early 1980s. It's illuminating to consider what HSE considered to be a RID or reportable disturbance of an asbestos-containing material. Exposure to a hazardous substance in sufficient quantities to cause ill health is defined as a dangerous occurrence under the reporting of incidents, dangerous occurrence diseases regulations. And the HSE website lists these activities. So any use of a power tool on most asbestos containing materials, any work that leads to physical disturbance of an asbestos containing material that should only be handled by a licensed contractor, or any disturbance of a sprayed coating, a lagging, or an asbestos insulation board. These would actually require submission of a notification to the HSE under the regulations, which may then lead to them disturbing. Also relevant to remember, of course, that a single exposure to something like this would be highly unlikely to cause an asbestos-related disease. But if there aren't the appropriate controls in place, and this sort of thing were to occur on an ongoing basis, you could well find yourself in a difficult situation. So let's look at the legal framework around asbestos then. Key regulation for us in terms of managing asbestos is Regulation 4, the duty to manage. HSE were resistant to implementing a specific regulation because they had argued that all of the requirements were already present in law, because we had the Health and Safety at Work Act dating from 1974. Clear obligations on employers to make sure that workplaces are safe and healthy. It actually specifically refers to hazardous substances and could reasonably be inferred to include asbestos. The workplace health, safety and welfare regulations, again, date all the way back to 1992 and require that workplaces are maintained in good condition and do not create unnecessary hazards, whether that's open-edged staircases or poorly maintained asbestos-containing materials. The management of health and safety at work regulations, of course, are the ones that require us to conduct a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. Current regulations date from 1999, but again, that requirement came in 1992. And if your risk assessment does not address asbestos, it is unlikely to be considered suitable and sufficient, was the HSE's argument. And then lastly, of course, the construction design and management regulations. Again, currently 2015 version. Again, first introduced in 1995, revised again in 2007, and then more recently still. And those are the regulations that clearly cover how you might deal with health hazards arising during construction or refurbishment. And again, that can reasonably be inferred to need to include asbestos to be considered sufficient. Of course, it's difficult to get people to do things exactly the way you want them to unless you tell them exactly how you want it done. So hence we have the control of asbestos regulations. Again, current version is 2012. Original version for our purposes, the first regulations to contain the duty to manage, which is Regulation 4, came out in 2002. So let's look at the duty to manage. These are quite a complicated piece of legislation, and that's partly because you can have so many different contractual setups that define who the actual duty holder might be. So it starts with the owner of the premises. Well, that makes sense. He owns the building and therefore owns the asbestos inside it. So if nobody else is responsible, then the owner will have practical duties. But the extent of those practical duties actually depends upon the contractual and other legal obligations towards the property. So the duty in Regulation 4 principally rests with the person in control of maintenance activities, whoever that may be. That again is logical because he's the person responsible for making sure the asbestos materials remain in good condition and do not deteriorate over a period of time. But that person can be the occupier, the landlord, a sublessor, or a managing agent. And then once again, where no such obligations exist, then the duty falls on the rather nebulous person in control of the premises, who could again be a number of different people. Looking at it from your viewpoint then, in a typical telecoms supply chain, that would mean that the duty holder could be any of these people. It could be the client seeking the service, it could be the service provider, it could be the network operator. It may actually be the surveying and planning team, which could be the contractor or the network operator direct. It could be the landlord or the building owner, again, subject to the legal requirements around it. The duty may then fall on the building commissioning team. So once you actually get to the construction phase, it becomes their responsibility to deal with the materials. Or if you're looking at long-term maintenance, it could be the in-life maintenance and repair team who would have the requirement contractually to maintain these materials. As an antidote to Regulation 4, Regulation 5 is worth a brief discussion. This is a very black and white regulation and is the key one for our purposes. It says that an employer must not undertake work in demolition, maintenance, or indeed anything else which is liable to expose his employees to asbestos unless he has carried out a suitable and sufficient assessment as to whether asbestos is present or has assumed that asbestos is present and you comply with the rest of the regulations. Put simply, if you haven't done a suitable and sufficient assessment, i.e. a survey in sufficient detail, you have to employ a licensed contractor to do any removal, opening up, whatever works you may require within the property, and do it as fully licensable work, which would clearly be prohibitively expensive. So what should you do to manage your risks? It starts with gaining asbestos information. As I've said, Regulation 4 requires the duty holder to take reasonable steps to find out if there are materials containing asbestos in non-domestic premises. So it is the duty of the landlord to maintain an asbestos management plan, which should include a register of any asbestos containing materials. Here's an example in front of you. The register is typically derived from an asbestos management survey, and for planned works you should be asking if the asbestos information exists for the building during, at the latest, the pre-work site visits. If the site representative is able to provide an asbestos register, you can at least check if any ACMs exist in the areas that you need to access. At this point, if you have a formal pre-start risk assessment procedure, which I'm hazarding a guess most of you do, ensure that the identification of asbestos is a key part of that risk assessment process. So your asbestos register will typically be found in the most recent asbestos survey for the building. However, the type of survey that has been conducted to produce the register is crucial. It's a common misconception that a management survey is sufficient to inform works that are being carried out. However, the management survey will typically only assess the reasonably accessible asbestos-containing materials. So in effect, it's only a survey of the surface materials. Any work that is therefore being planned which might involve disturbing the fabric of the building or accessing hidden voids will therefore need a refurbishment or demolition survey, which is a much more intrusive survey involving destructive inspection as needed to gain access to all areas, including those which may be difficult to reach. So if your existing information is either not available, which believe me is more common than you would think, or is out of date, which is also not unusual. As a rule of thumb, if it hasn't been updated for 3 to 5 years, it's probably worth starting again. Then you'll need to ask for the building owner to arrange for a survey to be carried out. If you've got a standing agreement with an asbestos consultancy, this can often be undertaken at a reasonably short notice. And these days, most of the companies are geared up to providing you with the results fairly quickly as well, in order to make sure you minimise delays to your projects. But it's also worth bearing in mind, you need to target the areas in which you will actually be working. R&D surveys can be expensive, so you don't want to waste money surveying areas that you don't need to gain access to. So share information as to exactly where you are going to be working. Worth, of course, making sure you appoint a reliable, competent organisation. UCAS accreditation is not currently a strict legal requirement for survey work as it is for air testing and analysis of bulk samples, but it is a good guide. Definitely worth checking that your company you're proposing to use has a UCAS accreditation or at least an equivalent quality assurance system in place. And as I mentioned, the more information you can give to them, the more money you can save by targeting your survey effectively. Surveys are time rich. It involves a couple of guys finding the hidden asbestos containing materials. The more information in terms of building plans and the actual scope of what you are planning within the building will enable them to accurately target the survey. But then, of course, if your survey does find asbestos-containing materials, you are going to have to consider some remediation. It may involve using a licensed contractor to remove AIB sprayed coatings or pipe insulation. You will also, of course, need an analyst to conduct the necessary air testing before an area can be reoccupied. So those initial steps would be applicable to non-domestic properties, but they wouldn't apply to a domestic property where you'll be hard-pressed to find any asbestos information. In the absence of asbestos information, there are a range of other control measures that you will need to consider. Training is definitely key amongst them. The asbestos regulations bring out several aspects of general health and safety very specifically, and training is a big one. Asbestos awareness training, which is generally a 2 to 3 hour classroom-based presentation initially, covering asbestos properties, risks to health, typical asbestos-containing materials, so that you stand a fighting chance of recognising it before disturbing it. Generally how to avoid exposure and emergency procedures, and that training should also be refreshed annually. It doesn't need to be a full classroom refresher, but some form of reminder. There are a number of online courses you can access these days. Risk assessment is, of course, a key element of all the safety management processes and needs to be embedded fairly early on. Some form of dynamic risk assessment in these kind of environments is probably a good idea. Always going to be difficult to get a tradesman sufficiently competent that he can accurately spot asbestos, but if he can at least conduct a risk assessment to inform him whether there is a significant risk, at which point he can back off, that is definitely a good idea. And then an emergency plan, again, key requirement of the control of asbestos regulations, Regulation 15. Amazing how often these don't exist. But the one thing we do not want to do is disturb a material accidentally and then not do something about it and allow people to become exposed after the event. Emergency plans are not complex. basically stop work, shut the area and seek some professional advice. It's all that's required, but very often doesn't happen. Personal protective equipment is quite important. There is slightly too much reliance in the construction industry generally of going straight to PPE, which should be a last resort, but the asbestos regulations are fairly clear. Exposure to asbestos should be reduced as low a level as reasonably practicable. If you can put a mask on, then you probably should put a mask on. Under the PPE regulations, an assessment is actually required, but again, if the asbestos regulations require as low as reasonably practicable, then it needs the highest possible standards of RPE. That is generally taken as a P3 respirator with orinasal respirator with face fit testing for the operatives. There are also, of course, some engineering controls you might want to consider. Matters as simple as if drilling a hole in a wall, drill it from the outside of the property rather from the inside, so that any fibre that is released to atmosphere rather than in an enclosed room. Equally, local exhaust ventilation is becoming increasingly common on most power tools and is also, of course, a good way of preventing exposure to dusts generally. Your operatives may also be exposed to things like wood dusts, which are carcinogenic. Silica, which is an equal concern, causes several thousand deaths a year currently, and you will actually control exposure to a number of different substances by using all of these control measures together. Some form of monitoring is also going to be required. You need some systems and checks in place to make sure that your operatives are in fact following the systems, are indeed using the equipment correctly. The face fit testing I just mentioned can include information for the operatives on how to maintain their respirators in good condition, how to put them on and make sure that they're put on correctly, etc. But a series of checks and balances to demonstrate compliance. Interestingly now, as part of the No Time to Lose campaign that IOSH have been running recently, they have actually done some investigation into compliance amongst construction operatives generally, and they found that almost 1 in 5 said that if they discovered asbestos, they wouldn't be clear about what to do. So that's not knowing what the emergency procedure would be. Pleasingly, 59% have been informed about asbestos risks. That still leaves 40% of the workforce that is not suitably trained. 23% say they have been exposed to asbestos, so that's quite worrying. 23% of the workforce knows that they have been exposed to asbestos, with only 27% saying they hadn't. One wonders how certain they can be about that. And the corollary would be that leaves 50% of the sample group who simply said they didn't know. And then 32% have never checked the asbestos register before they started work on a new site. Again, we need to push standards up. Large organisations probably very good at it, smaller ones not so, but worth checking that your organisation does have this covered. Reason is enforcement is changing scope recently. HSE, of course, enforce health and safety laws on site. You should be aware that inspectors are moving from bully, badger and cajole if they find poor compliance with the asbestos regulations into prosecution. And the fines are going up enormously, mainly because of the impact of the changes to the sentencing guidelines. Fines are now essentially based upon turnover rather than the severity of an individual incident. To give you some numbers, 2016-17, there were 200 asbestos cases prosecuted in the construction industry, leading to an average fine of 77,000, an increase of 100% on 12 months previously. The trend is worryingly and increasingly up. This case is being used by a lot of trainers recently, as it definitely set a new benchmark. 3 contractors, principal contractor, part of the professional team, and a demolition contractor hit from a single incident with a £1.27 million fine. headline here during the investigation was that HSE found that although an asbestos survey had been completed, there were multiple caveats and disclaimers which were not appropriately checked. In other words, breach of Regulation 5, very large fines. I should point out these fines have all been appealed, and on appeal have been reduced to approximately £600,000. That's still a £600,000 fine, where not too long ago £80,000 was considered large. It's not just contractors. Having discussed who the duty holder might be, another case here, in actual fact, the property firm, so the owner of the building, in this case, fined £180,000. Also, interestingly, for not dealing with the asbestos by finding it from a survey, so a breach of Regulation 5. Compensation cases, of course, can be relevant. Compensation cases will pay out of an employer's liability insurance. Being frequently sued will almost undoubtedly put your insurance premiums up, and of course all the attendant poor publicity that goes with it. As you may remember Andrew mentioning, average settlement via the Mesothelioma compensation fund is currently around about £134,000 a year. As he said, only about 3 years' wages. But it can be significantly more. Sticking with telecoms again, recent case studies. Sturdy Telecoms, case resolved last year. Man diagnosed with mesothelioma following a career as a cable layer. His exposure occurred in the 60s and 70s for a company called Sturdy Telephones. Was asked to drill holes into AIB and pull cables through them. Lawyers applied for mesothelioma compensation via the diffuse mesothelioma payment scheme. He was eventually awarded £180,000. Recent case, a British Telecom worker. There was an appeal by lawyers issued just last year to ex-BT workers to come forward with information on what their working conditions were like after an asbestos claim by a BT engineer dating back to the 1980s. He was exposed working in roof spaces and would come down, according to the court records, every day covered in dust, including asbestos. That particular case is still ongoing. Another similar case applies to a GPO worker who subsequently went to BT, worked from 69 to 96 as a telephone engineer in Birmingham. He was exposed to asbestos dust when rewiring the post office tower in the 1970s. 40 years later, when he developed mesothelioma. And then also, interestingly, in actual fact, the record payout for an industrial injuries compensation claim is actually an asbestos-related case. A case here of a widow who was paid £4 million in a court case. Her husband, unfortunately, didn't even live to see the case reach court, but he was a particularly high flyer, hence the level of compensation, but asbestos compensation is at the top of the tree. And lastly, of course, you might want to think about the impacts on reputational costs. Prosecutions are published on the HSE website and remain there for a goodly period of time. And of course, internet searches being what they are these days, newspaper reports are all filed online, and that information could remain online for many years, adversely affecting your public profile. So there we are, everybody. Brief word about Global Environmental. 10 years providing services around asbestos consultancy to all kinds of industries, including the telecoms, ranging from refurbishment, management surveys, out-of-hours response, arranging remediation, particular advice to the telecoms industry, and of course, asbestos awareness training, should you be interested in that avenue. Thank you very much for listening. Do we have any questions?
Excellent. Thanks very much, Paul, with some great points in there. I think we can all take away and review. I think we have got some time for some questions. Just a reminder, you can raise questions online through the Zoom meeting. We have already had a couple of questions in, Paul. First one from Leadville Parsons. So the duty holder must carry out a management survey and any works they have must have an R&D survey completed at all time for any works. I think that kind of comes onto that point you're talking about risk assessment, and particularly the dynamic risk assessments and your asbestos awareness training. Where's that balance, Paul, around how far you go on those jobs around identifying pre-existing asbestos and those management surveys?
Yes, it is quite difficult, and particularly the grey line, which was why I stressed it, is at the borderline with domestic properties. We can, to a degree, expect domestic properties to start falling into the regulations over the next 10 years, which will take away the blurring. But yes, it depends again on the contractual obligations. What tends to happen is that, in actual fact, the minute you start executing work as an employee, you've effectively created a construction site, and at that point, all of the requirements of the regulations potentially do kick in. Again, in practical terms, it's difficult to say that you should be spending thousands of pounds getting somebody to inspect an area that is only going to take 5 minutes to execute the work on, but potentially that is your obligation.
And I guess is there that sort of obligation on doing that proper planning and making sure where you can, you're doing non-intrusive works, or you're making use of alternative routes where you can positively identify there isn't any asbestos, I suppose. Correct.
That would make a good degree of sense. I mean, a good skilled tradesman will know fairly clearly when he's coming across a timber member that would quite clearly be safe to drill. And again, rather than drilling through the brickwork, which could expose him to silica dust as well, that might be a better way to go.
Cool. Brilliant. So we've got another question in from Rich Storr. How well regulated do you feel the removal industry is? Not only licensing, but workers' safety, work at height, electricity at work, confined space within those work enclosures?
Good question. There has actually been quite a strong press over the last 4 or 5 years for those of us who are actually in the industry to buck our ideas up. It was felt a few years back that we were very good at managing asbestos risks. Because we were very much focused on asbestos risks, we were quite poor at addressing exactly some of those issues, work at height being one. There was a definite trend for asbestos operatives falling, and it turned out that as we were trying to control the asbestos risk, we actually hadn't planned the work at height properly. Standards are going up. Standards are always going up. HSE are cutting the number of licence holders. Arguable just how effective that is, because the industry isn't getting any smaller. It just means there are more people working for fewer employers. But obviously the idea is those fewer employers are more competent than a large unregulated industry. There is still a way to go, and there are still some concerns, of course, that the exposure that we are giving our operatives could potentially lead them to develop mesothelioma in years to come. And unfortunately, of course, we won't really know how that pans out until we are another 20 years down the line and have some information on death rates amongst the guys who are old enough to be recording exposure from long after all of the prohibition regulations came in.
Indeed. Okay. No, thanks, Paul. So we've had a couple more in, actually. So we've got an anonymous person. So when working on wall ceiling artex from the 70s, 80s, how dangerous is this with regards to possible asbestos content? For example, if someone's been scraping it off with a paint scraper and no PPE, assuming that's not us doing that, but that's something we might be working in those areas afterwards, I suppose.
Intrinsically, the short answer is not very. Artex coatings and the like only contain 2 or 3% asbestos. Those asbestos fibres are well bonded within the matrix. You are unlikely to create much in the way of a measurable asbestos exposure by doing anything other than taking an orbital sander to the material. Again, it's more about prevention. If you've got an operative who is working on a daily basis, drilling holes in unknown materials, over a long enough period of time, when you could be talking 30 or 40 years, possibly that cumulative exposure could go on to have a significant effect. That's why we want to try to eliminate it. But an odd one-off, no, almost certainly will not cause you any more harm than going into a smoky pub for the evening. Not that you can anymore, of course, but you know what I mean.
No, thanks, Paul. So we haven't got any more questions. There's a couple of feedbacks in that. Oh, I tell you, I've just had a question pop in. So from Richard Howie, there's a proliferation of online training suppliers who state they are accredited to UCAS. Should these only be accepted if accompanied by a classroom training session?
As I said, with asbestos awareness training, certainly first iteration, if you've got an operative who's never had it before, he definitely wants to sit down in a classroom environment and get a proper 3 or 4 hour grounding. As you say, there are a number of, particularly the refresher courses are quite useful. It's inconvenient losing skilled operatives for half a day every single year to hear the same old stuff over and over again. But provided the training is delivered in a sensible way, there are a number of different accreditation schemes out there, UCATA being one of the bigger ones. So provided you've got some form of accreditation, of course, as the employer, it's to a degree down to you to assess whether or not the training that's been delivered has been competent. If you do book people onto it, get a bit of feedback from them. How much did they get out of it? Was it useful, or was it just a lot of lip service and could I actually doze off in the corner? For example, interactive ones are much better than just watching a video. The operatives can switch off. If you're required to enter multiple choice questions at the end of each section or something of the sort, you haven't got much choice but to follow the course, pay attention, and then hopefully you'll retain some of the information you've been given.
Brilliant. Actually, is it someone following up, anonymous attendee, around you said about soil contamination? So removal of World War II air raid shelters, the concrete may or may not contain asbestos. What are your thoughts around soil contamination on this type of thing? Because it's quite tough, isn't it? So you said exactly that around demolition sites and what may or may not have been left behind.
Soils can be a particularly difficult one. There are some fairly recent guidance out about soils contamination and what does and does not constitute significant contamination, but it can be very hard to quantify depending on what you actually come across. So you might find old asbestos cement shards that were buried following a demolition back in as far back as the Second World War even, that are still there. Those would not be terribly likely to give off a significant amount of fibre release. But if the materials you're coming across in the soils turn out to be asbestos insulation board, or God forbid, old clumps of lagging, brownfield sites around power stations, back in the day they used to just dump it out on the spoil heaps, and you can find it all over the place. So again, effectively, you come back to the need to do some form of a proper survey, which itself can be difficult unless you're in a position whereby you can turn over significant quantities of the soil to find out what is actually hidden in it. But it can be a bit of a minefield. The guidance is growing and developing, and probably still isn't really definitive. Once again, I'm afraid you're back to a case-by-case, risk assessed. What have we got in the survey? Is this a significant risk or not? And each case will turn on its own merits.
No, brilliant. Thanks, Paul. I'm conscious of time. If it's actually, I've got a last one here. Actually, there's something I was thinking about going through the presentation. Do you think people have forgotten asbestos a little bit, thinking it's a thing of the past?
There have certainly been some discussions. It's one of the points the IOSH No Time to Lose campaign make. Like a couple of the guys in the videos, particularly the younger ones. There is one particular case, a chap called Liam, who was is a roofer, aged only 33. So his exposure didn't occur until around about late 1990s, early 2000s. And he certainly makes exactly that point. I never thought it was still out there in the wider environment, but clearly it is. So we have consistently underestimated the risks from asbestos. 69 regulations, the 1985 regulations, we wound the ante up every 5-10 years ever since, and we still don't seem to be able to make inroads on the number of mesothelioma deaths. So it's important that we don't take our eye off the ball.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thanks again, Paul. I think it's been a really helpful insight for all of us on the call today. And I'd just say to everyone, do take a look at the Broadcasting and Telecoms IOSH group site as well if you haven't. And if you have any ideas for future sessions, please do get in touch and give us some feedback on the day. But again, thank you very much, Paul. I think it's a really, really useful session.
Thank you.